Clutching a soggy paper bag, Tristan chewed the inside of his cheek. In this part of town, the downpour tasted like exhaust and cheap copper. The lukewarm, foil-wrapped chicken sandwich inside the bag was bought with the literal last $4 in his checking account, and he desperately just wanted to eat his dinner. But the stranger sobbing on the wet concrete bench beside him, her mascara bleeding into her collar, was ruining his appetite. He had no desire to be a savior today. Neon light bled from the flickering sign of the 24-hour convenience store, painting the wet pavement in bruised shades of purple and red. Tristan sat heavy on the metal bench. His boots, crusted with drywall dust and warehouse grime, felt like concrete blocks strapped to his feet. A dull, pulsing ache radiated from his lower back all the way up to the base of his skull. 14 hours on his feet. 14 hours of lifting, stacking, moving pallets of things he could never afford to buy, all for a paycheck that was already spent before it even cleared. He rubbed his eyes with calloused fingers, the rough texture of his skin scraping against his eyelids. The night air was biting, carrying the sharp scent of damp asphalt and rotting leaves. Beside him on the bench, sitting far too close to the edge to be comfortable, was a woman. She didn't belong here. Even in the gloom, even soaked to the bone, Tristan could tell that much. Her trench coat was plastered to her shoulders, the fabric heavy and dark with rainwater, but the cut was sharp, tailored, the kind of fabric that didn't make that cheap swishing sound when you moved. But right now, she was just a hunched, shivering mass, her face buried in her hands. Her shoulders heaved with violent, ugly sobs. It wasn't a delicate, cinematic crying. It was a wet, choking sound, accompanied by jagged intakes of breath and the unmistakable sniffling of someone whose nose was running uncontrollably. Tristan tightened his grip on the paper bag in his lap. Inside was his prize, a mass-produced, heavily processed, spicy chicken sandwich. It was rapidly losing whatever heat the microwave inside the store had managed to force into it. He could smell the rancid, comforting odor of cheap frying oil and stale bread. His stomach contracted, a painful, hollow cramp that reminded him he hadn't eaten anything since a bruised banana at 6 in the morning. Don't look at her, he told himself. Look at the street. Watch for the bus. But the bus was late. The 2:15 a.m. route was always a gamble. The woman let out a pathetic, shuddering gasp. She dropped her hands, revealing a face smeared with ruined makeup. Dark streaks of mascara painted her pale cheeks like claw marks. Her hair, a tangled mess of wet, dark strands, clung to her neck. She stared blankly at a puddle near her expensive, ruined leather shoes. She looked entirely, comprehensively destroyed. Tristan ground his teeth. He felt a familiar, infuriating flare of empathy in his chest, hot and uncomfortable. He hated it. He couldn't afford empathy. He had a 6-year-old daughter sleeping on a sagging mattress in an apartment that smelled permanently of mildew and boiled cabbage. He had a stack of final notice utility bills sitting on a chipped Formica counter. He needed this sandwich. If he didn't eat it, he was going to wake up shaking and nauseous, and he had to be back on the forklift by 8. Let her cry, the cynical voice in his head argued. Rich people have safety nets. She'll call a cab. She'll go back to a warm house. You need the calories. He unwrapped the top of the foil. The smell of the salty, breaded chicken wafted up. It smelled like heaven. He opened his mouth, preparing to take a massive, selfish bite. Then she shivered. It was a violent, full-body tremor. She wrapped her arms around her ribs, her teeth actually chattering, the sound small and clicking over the hiss of passing tires on the wet road. She looked so small. For a split second, Tristan didn't see a stranger in an expensive coat. He saw his daughter, Chloe, 10 years from now, lost in a cold city, freezing, with no one giving a damn about her. "Son of a bitch," Tristan muttered aloud. The words tasted like ash. He didn't want to do it. He genuinely resented himself as his hands moved. He tore the foil wrapper down the middle, taking the lukewarm, squishy bun and snapping it in half. The spicy mayonnaise oozed onto his thumb. It was messy, uneven. The chicken patty gave way with a sad tear. He kept the smaller half for himself. He leaned over, closing the distance between them just enough, and shoved the larger half of the sandwich into her peripheral vision. The woman flinched violently as the foil-wrapped half sandwich appeared in front of her face. She recoiled, pressing her back against the cold glass of the bus shelter, her eyes wide and terrified, scanning Tristan as if he had just pulled a knife on her. Up close, the damage was worse. Her eyes were bloodshot, the skin around them swollen and puffy. She smelled faintly of old rain, copper, and something expensive, a floral perfume entirely masked by the scent of sheer exhaustion. "I don't have any money," she rasped, her voice cracked and dry despite the dampness around them. She shrank away. "Leave me alone, please." Tristan felt a spike of irritation. "Do I look like I'm mugging you with poultry?" His voice was gravelly, devoid of warmth. He didn't smile. He just held the food out a little further. "Eat it. You're shaking so hard the bench is rattling. It's annoying." She stared at the sandwich, then up at his face. Tristan knew what she saw. A big, tired man with dark circles under his eyes, greying stubble, and a faded flannel jacket that had seen better decades. He looked rough. He looked like the kind of guy a woman alone at a bus stop at 2 a.m. should avoid. "Why?" she whispered, wiping a mixture of snot and rainwater from her upper lip with the back of a trembling hand. "Because I broke it in half, and if you don't take it, the mayo is going to drip on my pants. Just take the damn food, lady." Hesitantly, as if approaching a feral animal, she reached out. Her fingers were ice cold as they brushed against his thick knuckles. She took the foil package. Tristan immediately pulled his hand back, leaned away, and bit into his half. It was terrible. The bread was rubbery from the microwave. The chicken was mostly spongy filler, and the spice was just a harsh, chemical burn on his tongue. But it was food. He chewed methodically, swallowing hard to force the dry lump down his throat. Beside him, the woman sniffed. Then she took a bite. She didn't eat delicately. Whatever reservations she had vanished the moment the cheap calories hit her tongue. She devoured it. She took huge, desperate bites, chewing with her mouth slightly open, not caring about the mayonnaise smearing the corner of her lips. She ate like someone who hadn't seen food in days, which struck Tristan as bizarre given her tailored coat. In less than 30 seconds, she had stripped the foil clean and was staring at the empty wrapper in her hands. "Slow down," Tristan grunted, looking straight ahead at the street. "You're going to throw that right back up." She swallowed hard, a painful gulp. She sat motionless for a moment, her breathing ragged. "It was good," she mumbled, her voice thick. "It was garbage," Tristan corrected her. "But it fills a hole." They sat in silence for another 10 minutes. The rain intensified, drumming a hollow, aggressive rhythm on the plastic roof of the shelter. Tristan wanted to ask her what she was doing out here, why someone who clearly had money was sitting on a public bench looking suicidal. But he didn't. Asking questions meant getting involved. Getting involved meant spending energy he didn't possess. "I lost everything tonight," she suddenly said. Her voice was flat, hollowed out. Not a plea for pity, just a statement of fact addressed to the rain. Everything I built, every person I trusted, gone in about 4 hours. Tristan kept his eyes on the road. He chewed the inside of his cheek, tasting the lingering chemical spice of the sandwich. "Welcome to the club," he said softly. "The dues are steep, but the seating is terrible." A short, sharp sound escaped her. It took Tristan a second to realize it was a laugh, immediately strangled by a sob. She covered her mouth, her shoulders shaking again, but this time it was quieter. Less hysterical, more resigned. 2 blinding headlights cut through the downpour, accompanied by the hiss of air brakes. The 2:15 bus, arriving at 2:40. Tristan stood up. His knees popped audibly. He tossed his crumpled foil into the overflowing trash can chained to the shelter. He didn't look back at her. He didn't offer a hand or a warm platitude. "Take care of yourself, lady," he muttered, stepping off the curb and into the harsh light of the open bus doors. He swiped his worn transit card, not turning around to see if she boarded. She didn't. As the bus pulled away, violently rattling over a pothole, Tristan caught a brief glimpse of her in the side mirror. She was still sitting on the bench, holding the empty foil wrapper, staring after the bus. Tristan sat in a hard plastic seat, his stomach rumbling in protest at the meager half-ration. He closed his eyes, instantly regretting giving away his food. Idiot, he thought, letting the vibration of the engine lull him into a shallow, exhausted sleep. The alarm clock on Tristan's phone sounded like a buzzsaw tearing through sheet metal. It was 6 a.m. He groaned, rolling over on the thin mattress. His spine screamed in protest. Every muscle fiber in his back felt like it was woven with ground glass. He dragged a heavy hand down his face, the sandpaper texture of his stubble reminding him that he needed to shave, though he likely wouldn't find the time or the energy. He shuffled into the tiny living area. The apartment was a cramped shoebox on the 3rd floor of a building that had given up on maintenance a decade ago. It smelled faintly of old dust and the cheap floral detergent he used to wash Chloe's clothes. Chloe was already awake. She was sitting cross-legged on the threadbare rug in front of a muted television, pushing a plastic dinosaur over a mountain made of unpaid envelopes. Her dark hair was a messy bird's nest. She looked up, her face lighting up with a missing tooth smile. "Morning, Daddy." Tristan felt that familiar, heavy squeeze in his chest, a mixture of overwhelming love and suffocating guilt. "Morning, Bug," he said, forcing a smile that felt tight on his face. He walked into the kitchenette, a space barely wide enough to turn around in. He opened the fridge, a half-empty carton of milk, a jar of pickles, and half a loaf of cheap white bread. No eggs, no butter. He pulled out the bread and the milk. "Peanut butter toast today," he called out, trying to sound enthusiastic. "Okay," Chloe chirped, easily pleased. As the bread popped in the ancient toaster, Tristan stared at the pile of mail on the counter. The red bold lettering on the top envelope practically glowed. Final notice, shut off pending. He needed $200 by Friday, or the lights went out. He had $12 to his name, factoring in the pathetic remains of his checking account. Payday was next Tuesday. The math didn't just look bad, it was mathematically impossible. He served Chloe her toast, poured her a small glass of milk, and drank a glass of tap water for his own breakfast. His stomach growled fiercely, remembering the half sandwich he had sacrificed hours ago. He pushed the thought away. Regret didn't pay the electric bill. By 7:30 a.m., Tristan had dropped Chloe off at the neighbor down the hall. Mrs. Gable, a chain-smoking retiree who watched Chloe for a few bucks a week. He was throwing on his heavy canvas work jacket when the knock came. It was sharp, authoritative. 3 brisk raps on the cheap veneer of his apartment door. Tristan frowned. The landlord usually just slid threatening notes under the door. He didn't knock unless he brought the police for an eviction. Tristan's heart hammered against his ribs. Not today. Please, God, not today. He walked to the door, his boots heavy on the linoleum, and pulled it open, his jaw set defensively. The words died in his throat. Standing in the dingy, flickering fluorescent light of the hallway was a woman. She was flanked by a man in a dark suit who looked like a middle linebacker with an earpiece. But Tristan barely noticed him. His eyes were locked on the woman. She was wearing a charcoal grey pantsuit that probably cost more than Tristan made in 3 years. Her hair was pulled back into a severe, flawless knot. Her makeup was immaculate, highlighting high, sharp cheekbones and piercing slate-grey eyes. She radiated an intimidating, cold power. She looked like a predator who had just finished a very satisfying meal. But as she looked at Tristan, the harsh lines around her mouth softened infinitesimally. It was the woman from the bus stop. Tristan just stared. He looked at her perfectly polished leather pumps, then up to the immaculate lapels of her jacket. There was no trace of the sobbing, broken mess from the night before. "You clean up well," Tristan blurted out, the filter between his brain and his mouth completely short-circuiting. The woman's lips twitched, fighting a smile. "So do you, Tristan, though the flannel is a consistent choice." Tristan narrowed his eyes, leaning heavily against the doorframe to mask the sudden unsteadiness in his legs. "How do you know my name? How did you find where I live?" "When you use a transit card registered in your name at a bus terminal, it leaves a digital footprint," she said smoothly. "And I have people who are very good at following footprints." "That's creepy," Tristan said bluntly. "And illegal." "Probably both," she conceded, without a hint of apology. She didn't invite herself in. She just stood there, holding a thick, cream-coloured envelope in one manicured hand. "My name is Beatrice Gallagher." The name tickled something in the back of Tristan's mind. He had seen it on a news ticker or the front of a discarded newspaper on the subway. Tech sector, corporate takeovers, something massive. "Good for you," Tristan said, crossing his arms. He was tired, hungry, and late for work. "Look, lady, Beatrice, whatever. I don't have time for a social call. If you're here to pay me back for the half a sandwich, just slide a $5 bill under the door. I have a forklift waiting for me." Beatrice didn't flinch at his tone. Instead, she stepped half a pace forward, her eyes locking onto his with an intensity that made Tristan want to step back. "Last night," she started, her voice dropping, losing some of the boardroom polish and finding the raw edge from the bus shelter. "My board of directors, led by my ex-husband, attempted a hostile coup. They locked me out of my own servers, froze my personal assets, and tried to force me into a corner where my only option was to sell my shares for pennies and disappear. I was wandering the streets for hours. I was entirely convinced that my life, as I knew it, was over." She paused, looking at the peeling paint on Tristan's doorframe. "I was sitting on that bench, calculating whether it would be faster to jump off a bridge or step in front of a train. And then, a man who looked like he had the weight of the world on his shoulders broke his dinner in half and gave it to me." Tristan shifted uncomfortably. He hated this. He hated earnestness. "It was just a crappy chicken sandwich. Don't make it a thing." "It was a reminder," Beatrice corrected him sharply, "that not everyone in the world is a blood-sucking parasite. It snapped me out of my panic. After you left, I walked 3 miles to a payphone, called the one lawyer I knew who hated my ex-husband more than I do, and we spent the last 12 hours tearing their coup to shreds on legal technicalities. I won, Tristan. I gutted them. The vicious satisfaction in her voice made Tristan blink. Great. Congratulations. Can I go to work now? Beatrice held out the thick envelope. The paper looked heavy, expensive. I don't need a thank you card, Tristan grunted, not taking his hands out of his pockets. It's not a card, Beatrice said. Her tone left absolutely zero room for argument. Inside is a deed, fully transferred and notarized, along with the foundational legal paperwork. I own a subsidiary logistics firm, warehousing, shipping, supply chain management. It's valued at roughly $50 million. Tristan stared at her. He looked at the envelope. Then he looked at the bodyguard, who remained entirely expressionless. You're out of your mind, Tristan whispered, a nervous, barking laugh escaping his chest. Is this a prank? Are you doing a hidden camera thing? He looked around the empty, stained hallway. I don't do pranks, Tristan, Beatrice said, her slate-grey eyes entirely deadpan. I'm giving you the company. Tristan's stomach gave a sharp, painful lurch. The hallway suddenly felt very hot, the flickering fluorescent lights blindingly bright. He looked down at the envelope, hovering in the space between them, and for the first time in his adult life, he found himself completely and utterly speechless. Tristan didn't reach for the envelope. He kept his hands wedged deeply in the pockets of his faded jacket, his knuckles white against the rough canvas interior. The air in the hallway felt suddenly thick, choked with the smell of cheap floor wax and Beatrice's faint, expensive perfume. I don't want your envelope, Tristan said. His voice was lower now, scraped raw by a sudden defensive anger. He didn't know how rich people operated, but he knew exactly how poverty worked. Nothing was free. Every gift had a hook buried somewhere in the meat. I gave you half a sandwich because you looked like you were going to freeze to death. That makes us even. We don't owe each other anything. Beatrice didn't lower her arm. Her expression remained entirely unchanged, a mask of calculated patience. It's not a gift, Tristan. It's a ledger correction. I don't care what you call it. I'm not taking a company. I drive a forklift for $14 an hour. I can barely manage to keep the electricity on in this apartment. He gestured blindly behind him, toward the cramped room where Chloe was watching cartoons. What the hell am I going to do with a logistics firm? Run it, Beatrice said simply. Or sell it, or run it into the ground. Once you sign the transfer papers inside this envelope, it ceases to be my problem. Tristan scoffed, shaking his head. You don't just give away a $50 million asset because a guy gave you some terrible processed chicken. That's insane. That's movie logic. Real people don't do that. Real people don't usually sit in the freezing rain in a soaked trench coat, she countered, her voice clipping slightly, betraying a crack in the armor. I told you, I lost everything yesterday. My company, my reputation, my control. For 4 hours, I was completely stripped of my identity. You didn't see a CEO on that bench. You saw a pathetic, broken woman. And you treated me like a human being anyway. She stepped closer, invading his personal space. The bodyguard shifted subtly, but Beatrice held up 2 fingers, stopping him. That subsidiary, she continued, her slate eyes drilling into Tristan's, is called Hayes Logistics. It was a pawn in my ex-husband's portfolio. He used it to move cheap freight and dodge taxes. It's bloated, it's mismanaged, and I acquired it in the countersuit this morning just to spite him. I have zero interest in the freight business. I was going to liquidate it by Friday and fire all 300 employees. Tristan felt a cold knot form in his stomach. 300 people, give or take, mostly warehouse workers, forklift drivers, people like you. Beatrice finally lowered the envelope, but only to place it deliberately on top of a plastic milk crate sitting next to Tristan's door. "I realized something at 3 in the morning, Tristan. I'm a shark. I destroy things to build better things. That's who I am. But last night, I didn't want to be a shark. I wanted someone to just give a damn. You did." She took a step back, smoothing the front of her charcoal jacket. "I don't want Hayes Logistics. I don't want the bad karma of firing 300 blue-collar workers today. So, I'm giving the headache to you. You know how warehouses work. You know how those people live. Fix it or fire them yourself, but it's yours." "I can't," Tristan breathed, the sheer weight of the concept crushing his lungs. "I don't have a degree. I don't know how to run a business." "You know how to share your last meal," Beatrice said, turning on her heel. "That's a better foundation for leadership than anyone on my former board of directors ever possessed." "The envelope has the deed, the transition documents, and a cashier's check to cover your immediate expenses while you figure it out. The lawyer's number is on the letterhead. Call him when you stop hyperventilating." She walked away, her heels clicking against the scuffed linoleum with terrifying precision. The massive bodyguard offered Tristan a single, unreadable nod before following her down the stairwell. Tristan stood in the doorway for a full minute, listening to the heavy metal fire door at the bottom of the stairs slam shut. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the tinny sound of the television inside his apartment. He looked down at the cream-colored envelope sitting on the milk crate. It looked violently out of place against the peeling paint and water-stained walls. It looked like a bomb. He wanted to kick it down the stairs. He wanted to pretend this morning never happened. He looked at his watch. 7:45 a.m. If he didn't leave right now, he was going to miss his bus, and Rick, his supervisor, would write him up again. 3 write-ups meant termination. Swearing under his breath, a harsh, jagged sound, Tristan snatched the envelope off the crate. It was heavy, thicker than he expected. He shoved it roughly into the inner pocket of his canvas jacket, zipped it up, and grabbed his keys. "I'm leaving, Chloe," he yelled into the apartment, locking the deadbolt behind him. He practically ran down the stairs, the thick envelope bumping heavily against his ribs with every step. A constant, physical reminder of the sheer absurdity of his morning. The warehouse smelled the way it always did. A suffocating mixture of diesel exhaust, damp corrugated cardboard, and the metallic tang of grinding brake pads. It was a cavernous, windowless structure, lit by high-pressure sodium bulbs that cast a sickly, yellowish hue over the endless rows of steel racking. Tristan sat on the rigid seat of his propane-powered forklift, his hands gripping the cracked steering wheel. The vibration of the engine traveled up his arms, settling into the familiar, dull ache in his lower back. It was 11:30 a.m. He had been shifting pallets of imported ceramic tiles for 3 hours, operating entirely on muscle memory. His brain was entirely disconnected from his body. Every time he inhaled, he felt the bulk of the envelope pressing against his chest. He hadn't opened it. He had stuffed his jacket into his rusted metal locker in the break room, but he could still feel it on him, a phantom weight dragging his posture down. $50 million. A company. 300 employees. The words echoed in his head, entirely devoid of meaning. They were abstract concepts, completely untethered from his reality. His reality was the blinking low-fuel light on his dashboard. His reality was the cramp in his calf. His reality was the $200 he needed by Friday to stop his apartment from going dark. "It's a scam," he told himself for the 100th time, reversing the forklift with a loud, piercing beep. "She's crazy. It's some kind of tax fraud scheme. She's setting me up as the fall guy." "Tristan! Hey, space cadet!" The harsh, barking voice cut through the mechanical din of the warehouse. Tristan slammed his foot on the brake pedal, the forklift jerking to a violent halt. A pallet of tiles swayed dangerously on the forks, threatening to tip over and shatter $1,000 worth of inventory onto the concrete floor. Rick, the floor supervisor, was marching down the aisle, a clipboard clutched in his hand like a weapon. Rick was a man who seemed permanently enraged by his own mediocrity. He wore a high-vis vest, stretched too tight over a burgeoning gut. His face flushed red from the ambient heat and high blood pressure. "What the hell are you doing?" Rick yelled, pointing the end of his pen at the swaying pallet. "You're driving like you're asleep. You drop that load, I'm taking it out of your paycheck, you hear me?" Tristan stared at Rick. For 3 years, Rick's voice had been a source of low-level terror. Rick controlled the shifts. Rick controlled the overtime. Rick held Tristan's precarious financial survival in the palm of his sweaty hand. Normally, Tristan would lower his head, mumble an apology, and get back to work. He would swallow the humiliation because he had to, because Chloe needed peanut butter and electricity. But today, Tristan just looked at the red-faced supervisor, feeling entirely detached. He felt the phantom weight of the envelope against his ribs. "I'm giving the headache to you," Beatrice had said. "You know how these people live." "I hit a zip tie on the floor," Tristan said flatly, his voice devoid of the usual subservience. "The wheel jerked. Pallet is fine." Rick blinked, momentarily thrown by the lack of apology. His face darkened. "Don't give me excuses, Tristan. You've been dragging arse all morning. I've got 3 trucks waiting at Dock 4, and you're moving like molasses. Get this dropped at aisle 12 and take your lunch early. You need to wake the hell up." Rick turned and stomped away, barking an order at another driver 2 aisles over. Tristan sat perfectly still. The engine rumbled beneath him. He looked at his calloused, grease-stained hands gripping the steering wheel. He slowly lowered the forks, letting the heavy wooden pallet hit the concrete with a solid, echoing thud. He didn't drive to aisle 12. He turned the key, killing the engine. He pulled the parking brake, stepped off the machine, and walked away from the cargo. The brake room was a dismal, windowless box located near the loading bays. It hummed with the aggressive rattle of a dying vending machine and the flicker of a failing fluorescent tube. The air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and microwaved chili. Tristan walked straight to his locker. He spun the cheap combination lock, yanked the metal door open, and pulled his canvas jacket off the hook. He reached into the inner pocket and pulled out the cream-colored envelope. His hands were shaking. He hadn't noticed until he tried to slide his finger under the thick wax seal on the back. It cracked with a dry snap. He sat down at a sticky folding table in the corner, ignoring the 2 other workers eating in silence across the room. He pulled the contents out. The first thing was a stack of legal documents bound with a brass clip. The paper was heavy, dense with corporate jargon. Tristan flipped past pages of indemnities, stock transfers, and holding company structures that he couldn't begin to parse. He stopped when he saw his own name, printed in stark black ink on a signature line at the bottom of a deed of transfer document. Tristan James Pendleton. It wasn't a joke. It was real. The sheer volume of legal engineering in his hands was undeniable evidence. He flipped to the next item. It was a single sheet of heavy stock paper with a gold-embossed logo at the top. Gallagher and Associates. Below it was a handwritten note. The penmanship was sharp, aggressive, and perfectly legible. "Tristan, the transfer is binding the moment you sign the bottom line, and text a photo of it to the number below. My lawyers have already filed the preliminary injunction to separate Hayes Logistics from my former holdings. You are now the sole equity owner. The attached cashier's check is drawn from my personal account as transitionary capital. Do not waste it. Do not disappoint me. BG." Tristan's breath hitched in his throat. He slowly moved the note aside to reveal the final piece of paper in the envelope. It was a bank draft, a cashier's check. Tristan stared at the numbers printed in the center of the rectangle. He stared at the commas. He blinked, rubbing his eyes with the heel of his hand, thinking the yellow fluorescent light was playing tricks on his exhausted retinas. He looked again. Pay to the order of Tristan James Pendleton. Amount $100,000. $100,000. Tristan's stomach bottomed out. A wave of intense, crippling nausea washed over him, so violent and sudden that he had to grip the edges of the folding table to keep from sliding off the plastic chair. The blood drained from his face, leaving a cold, clammy sweat breaking out across his forehead. He had never seen $1,000 in one place in his entire life. This piece of paper sitting on a sticky breakroom table held more money than he had earned in the last 4 years combined. It was enough to pay his electric bill, enough to pay his rent for a decade, enough to buy Chloe a new mattress, new clothes, a college fund. A sharp, high-pitched ringing started in his ears, drowning out the hum of the vending machine. His vision tunneled. He was having a panic attack. He knew the symptoms. He had had one the day his wife walked out, leaving him alone with a 1-year-old. He squeezed his eyes shut, forcing himself to take a deep, jagged breath. The air smelled of cheap chili and floor cleaner. Grounding himself. It's real. She wasn't lying. He opened his eyes and looked at the check again. It hadn't changed. He looked at the legal documents beneath it. The deed to Hayes Logistics. He wasn't just a guy with a lucky check. He was a guy who owned a company that employed guys exactly like him. Guys who were currently being screamed at by supervisors like Rick. Tristan slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out a cheap ballpoint pen. He clicked it. The sound was loud in his own head. He signed his name on the transfer deed. His signature was messy, a jagged scrawl born of a shaking hand and a fractured reality. He pulled out his cracked smartphone, took a picture of the signed document, and texted it to the number on Beatrice's note. The phone buzzed almost instantly. A reply. Confirmed. Mr. Pendleton, this is David Sterling, Chief Counsel for Miss Gallagher. Hayes Logistics is legally yours. Please call me at your earliest convenience to arrange the handover of administrative access. Tristan stared at the screen. He carefully folded the documents and the check, placed them back into the envelope, and slid it into his jacket pocket. He stood up. His legs felt like they belonged to someone else, but they held his weight. Tristan pushed through the swinging doors of the breakroom and stepped back onto the warehouse floor. The noise hit him like a physical blow. The grinding gears, the shouts, the endless rhythmic thud of commerce moving from one box to another. He didn't walk back toward his forklift. He walked straight down the main aisle, heading directly for the time clock near the front office. Rick appeared from between 2 massive shelves of dog food, a scowl firmly etched onto his sweating face. "Pendleton!" Rick barked, intercepting him. "I thought I told you to drop that pallet in aisle 12. Your machine is just sitting there blocking traffic. What the hell is wrong with you today?" Tristan stopped. He looked at Rick. He didn't see an intimidating supervisor anymore. He just saw a tired, angry man in a cheap vest, trapped in a concrete box, yelling at another tired man. "I'm clocking out, Rick," Tristan said. His voice was quiet, eerily calm. Rick's jaw dropped in disbelief. "You're what? It's noon, Tristan. You walk out now. You are abandoning your shift. I will fire you on the spot. You won't have a job to come back to tomorrow." Tristan reached up and unclipped his company ID badge from his collar. It was cracked down the middle, his photo faded and smudged with grease. He held it out. "I know," Tristan said. Rick stared at the badge, then up at Tristan's face, searching for a trace of a joke or a breakdown. He found neither. "You're serious, you're quitting. Over what? A bad morning?" "You have a kid, Tristan. You're going to throw away your paycheck." "I found a better opportunity," Tristan said softly. He dropped the plastic badge. It hit the concrete floor with a hollow clatter. He stepped around the stunned supervisor and walked out the loading bay doors, stepping into the glaring afternoon sunlight. The air outside tasted different. It still smelled like exhaust, but it didn't feel heavy. Tristan walked to the bus stop. He sat on the bench. It was a different bench from last night, but the plastic felt the same against his back. He pulled the envelope out of his jacket again. He needed to touch it. He needed to feel the physical evidence that he hadn't just hallucinated the last 3 hours and ruined his life. He rode the bus back to his neighborhood, his hand resting securely over his chest pocket the entire time. When he reached his apartment building, he didn't go upstairs. He walked to Mrs. Gable's door on the first floor and knocked. The door creaked open, revealing the elderly woman, a lit cigarette pinched between her wrinkled fingers. "Tristan? What are you doing here so early? You sick?" "No, Mrs. Gable. I'm okay," Tristan said, forcing a smile that felt tight on his face. "Just got off early. Can I get Chloe?" Chloe came running out a moment later, her face smeared with something that looked suspiciously like cherry popsicle. "Daddy!" she yelled, throwing her arms around his knees. Tristan scooped her up, burying his face in her messy hair. She smelled like sugar and old dust. He squeezed his eyes shut, feeling a sudden, overwhelming urge to cry. The stress, the shock, the sheer crushing relief of the check in his pocket, it all crested over him in a suffocating wave. "You okay, Daddy?" Chloe asked, pulling back to look at his face, her small brow furrowed in concern. Tristan cleared his throat, blinking rapidly. "I'm great, Bug. I'm really great. Go get your jacket. We're going out for lunch." "Peanut butter?" she asked hopefully. "No," Tristan laughed, the sound rusty and strange in his own throat. "We're going to the diner. We're getting burgers, real ones, with fries and milkshakes." 10 minutes later, they were sitting in a cracked vinyl booth at a diner 3 blocks away. It wasn't a fancy place. The table was slightly sticky, and the menu was laminated and stained with coffee rings. But to Tristan right now, it felt like a Michelin star restaurant. He ordered a double cheeseburger for himself, chicken tenders for Chloe, and a large plate of fries to share. When the waitress, a tired-looking woman with a name tag that read Brenda, walked away, Tristan watched her go. He noticed the heavy slump of her shoulders. He noticed the way her sensible, non-slip shoes scuffed against the floor. He recognized the bone-deep fatigue in her posture. It was the same fatigue he had worn for years. He pulled his phone out of his pocket. He looked at the text message from David Sterling, the lawyer. He owned a company with 300 employees, 300 people who walked heavy, who dreaded supervisors like Rick, who worried about utility bills and cheap groceries. Beatrice had thrown the company at him like a discarded toy, an annoyance she didn't want to deal with. To her, $50 million was a rounding error. To Tristan, it was a terrifying responsibility. He didn't know how to read a balance sheet. He didn't know how to negotiate shipping contracts or manage middle management. He was a forklift driver who had just been handed the keys to a kingdom he didn't understand. But he knew how it felt to be at the bottom of the ladder. He knew what happened when the people at the top made decisions without caring about the people executing them. The waitress returned, dropping a basket of steaming golden fries onto the table. Chloe immediately grabbed one, burning her fingers and giggling. Tristan picked up a fry. It was hot, salty, and perfect. He ate it slowly, feeling the calories settle into his empty stomach. He unlocked his phone, dialed the number for David Sterling, and pressed the phone to his ear. "Law offices of Sterling and Associates," a crisp voice answered. "Yeah, hi," Tristan said, staring at the grease stains on his laminated menu. "This is Tristan Pendleton. I need to speak to David. Tell him the new CEO of Hayes Logistics wants to see the books." Monday morning tasted like stale toothpaste and burnt diner coffee. Tristan stood on the sidewalk outside the corporate headquarters of Hayes Logistics. It wasn't a warehouse. It was a 4-story block of reflective black glass and steel shoved between a highway overpass and a gentrifying industrial park. He pulled at the collar of his shirt. It was a pale blue button-down he had bought at a discount store 3 years ago for a traffic court appearance. The cotton blend felt stiff and scratchy against his neck. His boots, though scrubbed with a stiff bristled brush for an hour last night, still bore the faint, indelible stains of industrial grease. He looked exactly like what he was, an intruder. David Kensington, the sharply dressed junior partner sent to facilitate the handover, stood next to him holding a slim leather briefcase. Kensington smelled of peppermint and expensive dry cleaning. "You don't have to do a town hall, Mr. Pendleton," Kensington said, checking a silver watch that likely cost more than Tristan's newly acquired bank account. "We can finalize the administrative transfer in the boardroom, sign the payroll authorizations, and you can go home. The executive team is fully prepared to continue daily operations without your direct interference." "Interference," Tristan repeated, testing the weight of the word. It felt heavy, unfair. "They think I'm just going to cash a dividend check and let them keep running it into the dirt. They think you are a forklift driver who won a bizarre lottery," Kensington corrected smoothly, devoid of malice. "They expect you to sell the equity to a private firm within the month. Honestly, that would be my legal advice too." Tristan stared at his faint reflection in the dark glass of the building. He saw the dark circles under his eyes, the greying stubble he hadn't quite managed to shave perfectly. He thought about Rick, yelling over a dropped pallet. He thought about the final notice utility bill sitting on his kitchen counter, now rendered entirely meaningless by a 6-figure cashier's check currently clearing in his local credit union. "Let's go interfere," Tristan grunted, pushing through the revolving doors. The lobby was a sensory shock. It didn't smell like cardboard or diesel. It smelled of ozone, filtered air conditioning, and citrus floor cleaner. The silence was oppressive. No grinding gears, no backup alarms. Just the soft hum of the HVAC and the muted clicking of a receptionist's keyboard. They took the elevator to the 4th floor. The boardroom was a sprawling expanse of frosted glass and pale wood. Sitting around a massive polished table were 4 people. They wore tailored suits. They had perfect posture. And as Tristan walked in, their collective gaze hit him like a physical wall of contempt. A man at the head of the table stood up. He had slicked back silver hair and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Pendleton, I'm Greg Harrelson, Chief Operating Officer. We are deeply surprised by the sudden transition of ownership, but we are committed to making this as frictionless as possible for you." Tristan didn't shake his hand. He didn't sit down at the head of the table. He walked over to the side, leaning awkwardly against the expensive wood paneling, crossing his arms. His heart was hammering against his ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. "I don't know what EBITDA is," Tristan said. His voice was louder than he intended, rough around the edges. The executives exchanged rapid, microscopic glances. Harrelson's smile widened, taking on a distinctly predatory edge. "There's absolutely no need for you to concern yourself with the financial minutiae, Mr. Pendleton. We have summary briefs prepared that outline." I know what bald tires look like, Tristan interrupted, ignoring him. He looked at the printed binders sitting in front of each executive. I know that when a propane forklift stalls in reverse, it means the fuel lines haven't been bled. I know that if you cut the warehouse ventilation to save on the electric bill during July, people pass out. Which one of you authorized the maintenance freeze on the Dallas and Chicago fleets? Silence descended on the room. It wasn't the respectful silence of a corporate meeting. It was the stunned silence of a trap snapping shut on the wrong ankle. A woman in a sharp navy blazer cleared her throat. The maintenance deferral was a strategic cost-saving measure to temporarily boost quarterly margins prior to the attempted acquisition by... She trailed off, glancing at Kensington. Prior to Beatrice's ex-husband trying to gut the company, Tristan finished for her. He pushed off the wall and walked to the table. He grabbed the thickest binder, flipped it open, and stared at pages of spreadsheets that looked like absolute gibberish to him. He slammed it shut. I don't want summaries, Tristan said, the adrenaline finally settling into a cold, hard anger. I want the raw maintenance logs. I want the worker compensation claims for the last 2 years. And I want them in plain English. Anyone who hides a broken machine behind a strategic cost-saving measure doesn't work for me anymore. Harrelson's face flushed. You can't just walk in here and threaten the executive board, Pendleton. You have no idea how to run a logistics network. No, Tristan agreed flatly. I don't, but I know how to drive a forklift. And starting tomorrow, Harrelson, so do you. You're reporting to the loading dock at 6 a.m. Wear steel-toe boots. Harrelson stood up, slamming his hands on the table. I absolutely will not. Then you're fired, Tristan said. The words tasted terrifying. They felt illegal. But as he looked at Kensington, the lawyer simply gave a slow, imperceptible nod. Tristan turned his back on the sputtering COO. His palms were sweating profusely. He was winging it. He was a fraud in a cheap shirt, holding a detonator. But for the first time in his life, his finger was actually on the button. 3 weeks later, the physical toll of the $100,000 check had vanished, replaced by an entirely new strain of exhaustion. Tristan's apartment no longer smelled of mildew. The late notices were gone. Chloe had a new mattress, a pile of unworn winter clothes, and a babysitter who didn't chain smoke indoors. But Tristan rarely saw the apartment awake. He spent his days buried in the belly of the beast. He had abandoned the 4th-floor executive suite, moving his base of operations to a cramped, windowless manager's office attached to the primary dispatch warehouse on the ground floor. It smelled faintly of old coffee and dust, but he could hear the trucks. He needed to hear the trucks. He was staring at a laptop screen, his eyes burning as he tried to decipher a supply chain routing map, when the office door swung open without a knock. Beatrice Gallagher stood in the doorway. She looked exactly as intimidating as the morning she had ambushed him at his apartment. She wore a tailored crimson coat, her dark hair pulled back flawlessly. She looked completely out of place against the backdrop of peeling corkboards and rusted filing cabinets. I heard a rumor you fired your entire logistics planning committee and replaced them with shift supervisors, Beatrice said, inviting herself in and sitting in the single, squeaky guest chair. Tristan rubbed his tired eyes, pushing the laptop away. They weren't planning anything. They were just figuring out how to squeeze an extra 10 minutes of unpaid labor out of the drivers. I put people in charge who actually know how long it takes to load a 53-foot trailer. Your margins are dropping, Tristan. Beatrice crossed her legs, resting her hands on her expensive leather handbag. Kensington sends me courtesy updates. You've increased baseline pay, authorized sweeping equipment repairs, and halted 3 profitable contracts because you deemed the client expectations abusive to your drivers, your bleeding capital. The company was bleeding people, Tristan shot back, a defensive edge creeping into his voice. Turnover was at 40%. You can't run a warehouse if you have to retrain half the floor every 6 months. I'm stabilizing the foundation. Beatrice tilted her head, her slate-grey eyes studying him like a fascinating, slightly defective puzzle. You look terrible. You're a millionaire now, technically. Why are you wearing the same canvas jacket? Tristan looked down at the frayed cuffs of his sleeves. He didn't have an answer that wouldn't sound pathetic. The truth was, wearing an expensive suit felt like a betrayal. He felt that if he put on a Rolex, he would forget how heavy a pallet of ceramic tiles was. He was terrified of becoming Harrelson. "I'm comfortable," he lied. Beatrice didn't buy it, but she didn't press. She leaned forward, the faint scent of her expensive floral perfume cutting through the stagnant air of the office. "I didn't come here to audit you," she said, her voice softening just a fraction. It was the same tone she had used on the bus bench. "I came to see if you were drowning. Most people, when handed power they didn't earn, either paralyze themselves with fear or become tyrants. You're doing something weird. You're trying to be fair. Is that a bad thing? In business? Usually yes. It gets you eaten." Beatrice stood up, smoothing her coat. "But my ex-husband tried to eat you last week with a predatory buyout offer, and you told him to— what was the phrase you used in the email?" Tristan felt a flush of embarrassment. "I told him to perform an anatomically impossible act with a pallet jack." A sharp, genuine laugh escaped Beatrice's lips. It was a startling sound, bright and uncalculated. "You did. He threatened to sue for unprofessional conduct. Kensington is having a field day with it." She walked to the door, pausing with her hand on the knob. She looked back at Tristan, the harsh fluorescent light casting long shadows across her sharp cheekbones. "You shared your sandwich with a ghost, Tristan," she said quietly. "I was dead that night. You pulled me back. I gave you this company to settle the ledger, but also because I wanted to see what a good man does when the system hands him the whip. Don't disappoint me by going bankrupt." Before Tristan could formulate a response, she was gone, the heavy metal door clicking shut behind her. Tristan sat in the silence of his office. He pulled up the company's financial dashboard. She was right. The line was trending down. Morale was up, turnover was dropping, but the sheer cost of fixing years of negligent, deferred maintenance was eating the cash reserves alive. He needed a miracle, or he needed to make the kind of ruthless decision he had sworn he would never make. The rain was coming down in sheets, violently drumming against the corrugated metal roof of the warehouse. It was 2 a.m. on a Friday. Tristan stood on the loading dock, the damp chill seeping through his jacket. The massive rolling doors were open, revealing the black, wet expanse of the shipping yard. A single 18-wheeler was backed into Dock 4, its hazard lights blinking rhythmically in the gloom. Inside the trailer, 3 men were frantically securing a load of medical supplies. It was a massive, last-minute contract. A regional hospital network had been let down by their primary supplier, and they needed emergency dialysis fluids distributed across 3 states by dawn. Every other logistics firm had quoted them a 48-hour turnaround. Tristan had quoted them 6. If they pulled this off, the premium on the emergency contract would plug the hole in the quarterly budget. If they failed, the penalties would bankrupt Hayes Logistics by Monday. Tristan wasn't watching from the office. He was wearing heavy leather work gloves, his back screaming in familiar agony as he dragged a manual pallet jack out of the rain-slicked trailer. "We need 2 more pallets of the saline," yelled Marcus. Wait, no, his name was Dave. Dave, a shift supervisor Tristan had promoted 2 weeks ago. Dave was covered in sweat despite the freezing rain. The forklift is struggling on the dock plate. It's too slippery. "Leave the lift," Tristan shouted over the roar of the rain. "Grab the manual jacks. We push them in by hand. Let's go." Tristan ran back into the warehouse, grabbing the handle of a heavily loaded pallet. It weighed over 2,000 pounds. He threw his weight against it. The wheels caught on a groove in the concrete. He gritted his teeth, his boots sliding slightly on the damp floor, the muscles in his legs burning with a fierce, blinding heat. Suddenly, another set of hands grabbed the frame of the pallet next to him. It was an older guy, a driver named Frank, who usually clocked out right at midnight. Frank didn't say a word. He just leaned his shoulder into the load and pushed. Behind them, 2 more warehouse workers, who were supposed to be off shift, grabbed the sides. With a collective grunt, they forced the heavy pallet over the dock plate and into the trailer. Tristan stood panting, wiping a mixture of sweat and rainwater from his eyes. He looked at the men around him. They were exhausted, filthy, and entirely off the clock. "Why are you guys still here?" Tristan gasped, leaning heavily on the jack handle. "Shift ended 2 hours ago." Frank spat a wad of gum onto the wet pavement. He looked at Tristan, his face lined with years of hard labor. "Word came down from Dave. Said the new boss bet the whole company on this run. Said if we lose it, the suits come back." Frank shrugged. "I hate the suits, and you authorized the dental plan. My kid got his braces yesterday, so we push." Tristan felt a tightness in his throat that had absolutely nothing to do with physical exertion. He looked at the faces of the men in the dim yellow light. There was no corporate loyalty here. There were no synergy seminars or team-building retreats. It was just a ledger, but it wasn't measured in dollars. It was measured in sweat, in respect, in the unspoken understanding that the guy at the top was willing to bleed in the mud with the guys at the bottom. "One more pallet," Tristan said, his voice cracking slightly. He swallowed hard, pushing the emotion down into the hollow of his stomach. "Let's get this truck on the road." By 3:15 a.m., the trailer doors slammed shut. The locking bar was engaged, the air brakes hissed, and the massive diesel engine roared to life, pulling away from the dock and vanishing into the heavy rain. Tristan stood on the edge of the concrete platform, watching the red taillights disappear. His body was completely broken. His hands were blistered, his clothes were soaked through, and he smelled terribly of exhaust and wet cardboard. He pulled his phone from his pocket. The screen was cracked, a remnant of his old life. He opened his banking app. The balance sat there, a massive, impossible number, a safety net that would catch Chloe if he fell. He didn't feel like a CEO. He didn't feel like a millionaire. He felt like a guy who had just barely survived a 14-hour shift. But as he turned around and looked at the cavernous warehouse, his warehouse, he didn't feel the suffocating dread he used to feel. The grinding gears and the high-pressure sodium lights didn't look like a prison anymore. They looked like a machine, and for the first time in his life, his hands were firmly on the steering wheel. He had no idea where he was driving, and he was terrified of crashing, but he knew one thing for certain. He was never going to let the tank run empty again. If Tristan's raw journey from a desperate forklift driver to a leader fighting for his people resonated with you, don't scroll away just yet. We all know what it feels like to be overlooked, and this story proves that empathy is the ultimate currency. Hit that like button to support real, grounded storytelling. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that a single act of kindness can completely rewrite your future. And make sure to subscribe to the channel right now. Hit the bell icon so you never miss another gritty, deeply human story. See you next time.